I think we've got the majority of the attendees that we're expecting here now, so we'll kick off with the meeting. Hopefully some of you have attended these before and you're familiar with the format of this. So my name's Rebecca Roberts-Hughes and I'm the Director of Policy and Communications, and my colleagues will introduce themselves as they come to speak during the agenda. You will be able to see some slides, and we will talk you through the consultation responses to the Education Tomorrow's Architects reforms. We'll talk you through what we're doing next and the publication of the outcomes and the standards, and then there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions. So please do submit questions as and when they arise. You should have an ability to do that as a Q&A option at the bottom of the screen for most of you. So please submit your questions and we'll come to you as and when. Right, so I'll hand over to Hugh Simpson, our Chief Executive, to talk you through the proposals that we put together to start the presentation. Thanks.
Thanks, Rebecca. Hopefully Finn will be able to put the slides up. Yeah, I guess just to reiterate what Rebecca has said, I'm delighted to be able to run through both what we've found as part of our consultation, but also what we're proposing to do next. And I think one of the things to emphasize is that there's a bit of a journey. So this is very much the first phase of reforms, but I think as you'll hear from us, there are some things which emerged through the consultation where clearly we've been given lots of food for thought, and I think there are some other things and additional things that we will need to take forward without wanting too many spoilers. Professional practical experiences is just one such example where we've heard some really helpful feedback as part of the consultation. If we move on to the next slide, Finn. What you'll see is again probably a pretty familiar summary, and some of you will have seen this slide before. Those of you who haven't, it's an attempt to articulate in a relatively simple way what essentially is a very complex framework, and that's the framework that's required for individuals to qualify and to practice as architects in the United Kingdom. Essentially, if you look at from a linear progression at the top, a traditional model is that the undergraduate degree, known as the Part 1, or certainly in the English and Welsh academic system, a level 6 qualification, followed by professional practical experience, normally a year. Then a master's degree in architecture, again, colloquially known as the Part 2, which is again equivalent to a level 7 academic qualification in England and Wales, and then again further professional practical experience, often alongside the professional practical examination known as the Part 3. Again, the line at the bottom indicates that if you were to take a kind of a traditional linear approach, it would take a minimum of 7 years to complete. But obviously, one of the bits of feedback we commonly hear is that it's an absolute minimum of 7 years, and for a whole range of reasons, it often takes much longer. The other thing probably to reflect is that while it's linear for most people, these are not 3 linear steps for everyone. Some people complete different parts at different stages, so you could potentially see it more as a pie chart with the 3 parts making up the whole, which is the necessary academic and practical qualifications necessary. So part of the consultation was looking at the current framework and what we could potentially do to improve some of the issues and the feedback we had. And the particular areas that we heard were that it was fragmented, it took long periods of time to complete, and that it wasn't accessible. So again, very much a kind of a bit of a snakes and ladder process, whereby if you didn't have each of the qualifications, you had to go back and complete them. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll summarize where we're at. And again, I think want to focus pretty much on the central bit, those 2 boxes around academic and practice outcomes. And I guess one of the things that's really important to emphasize is that as a professional regulator, as a regulatory body, you can summarize our role and responsibility in pretty simple terms, and that's assuring the public that those who join the register are suitably qualified and competent to do so. So actually what we've tried to think about through this process is not so much how we can describe each of the different stages of an architect's journey to registration, but what must they be able to demonstrate at the point of registration? And those are really broken down into two areas. One is the academic outcomes. So what is the knowledge, particularly in relation to the academic journey, but also the practical elements around that. So the skills and the behaviors. So at the entry point, again, trying to move away from specifying and mandating a specific entry into that route and trying to open up different routes. And then towards the end, being very clear in the articulation around what are the competencies and qualifications required for registration. So essentially moving away from that first slide I showed, which is a linear process mandating what you must have at each stage, to more of an assurance model where we describe to the public and to the rest of the profession what are the competencies required. If we move on to the next slide, I think Rebecca's going to talk us through the consultation and what we heard in relation to the feedback on that journey and some of those sort of more philosophical or pedagogical concepts we introduced.
Yep, great. Thank you, Hugh. So we received 672 responses to this consultation, and it demonstrated quite a wide reach across the different groups that we wanted to hear from. So 43% of respondents were registered architects, and that excludes those who were also academics. We included those in the next group along there. So 22% of our respondents were academics, 13% were students, 10% were architectural assistants, consultants or designers, and 12% were other built environment professionals. So we're confident that we heard from all relevant stakeholder groups. One of the things that often comes up when we hold webinars and speak to all of you after a consultation is that we're not very clear at the outset about what a consultation is and how it differs from, for example, market or social research. So for market research, we'd be wanting to establish trends and an understanding of views across a representative group. So we'd identify the specific audience we want to hear from, whether that's the general public or architects, and we'd want a minimum proportion of that group to respond, and we'd want to make sure that the characteristics of the respondents mapped that group. A consultation is quite different. So it's a statutory obligation for organisations like ARB that make policy, in this case, regulatory policy. So the role of a consultation is that we tell you what we want to do and what our proposals are and what we want to change, and you have an opportunity to tell us how it's going to impact you and to bring to light things that we may not have thought about or other things that we might want to consider. So we try to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to respond, but we're not looking for a minimum proportion of respondents. We're not trying to force people to tell us what they think. It's always an option. So you have the right to have your say, and you have a right for us to consider your viewpoint and what you think we should be doing. It's not a vote and it's not a referendum, but it does help us to understand and compare the views of different groups and whether they agree with one another, and also how common a particular view is. So on the following slides, you will see some statistics, and that tells us how common a point is and who has raised it. So the next slide, please, Finn. So we released this about a month ago now, so hopefully most of you are familiar with this. But on the proposed regulatory framework that Hugh has just talked through, 40% of respondents agreed with it and 43% disagreed. More people agreed that the proposals will widen access to the profession than didn't, so 43% agreed and 36% disagreed, and groups that are currently underrepresented within the profession were more likely to agree. So the next thing we did was look at that 43% and why they disagreed, because we wanted to understand whether there was a different framework that would appeal to more people or would deliver our vision in a better way. And we also wanted to understand whether those people had suggested modifications we could make to our framework that would address the concerns or the risks that they're raising. There was little alignment in that 43% in terms of what they thought we should do instead. So 12% of respondents wrote to us that we should retain the regulatory requirement for an undergraduate degree, and 4% wrote to us that we should change nothing whatsoever. One of the concerns that was commonly raised by respondents was about funding and whether our changes would have adverse financial impacts on students or on learning providers. And the quote on the bottom right of the screen there typifies some of what we heard from people. And then we also heard the concern that our changes could reduce standards of the profession. So 14% wrote this, and they often wrote it in relation to our proposals on professional practical experience. Now, Hugh's already touched on this, but we did propose removing the 2-year minimum duration of professional practical experience, and 60% of respondents disagreed with this. Some felt that we could reduce the time but not remove it altogether, and others felt that that experience was too essential. So Hugh, if we just leave this slide up for a moment, if you wouldn't mind talking through the decisions that the board made as a result of these results in the consultation. You're on mute, Hugh.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. I mean, I think we can break down into a number of different component parts what the board's conclusions were, and I think it's pretty fair to say that just emphasising what you were saying, there was some mixed feedback from both across the profession, but also within different component parts of the profession. In terms of the regulatory framework, the board wanted to continue to pursue the opportunity to open up new routes to registration. And so within that, what they've clearly stated is that the accreditation, the regulatory interventions should come later on that journey. So as we set out at the start, that the board would accredit and regulate the master's level qualifications, that's level 7 in England or 11 in Scotland, as well as a diploma to assess the practical experience. In relation to the proposal in relation to the 2-year practical experience, again, they felt that the evidence was pretty compelling, that we needed to go back and look at that again. And so we'll maybe talk about that later on in the webinar about what they're proposing to do. And in relation to kind of those broader questions about the transition, the accreditation, again, would look to continue that, working with the profession. So the headline in relation to the regulatory framework is that the feedback that the board considered was that they should continue with it, recognising there was quite a lot of mixed feedback, whereas, as you say, Rebecca, a lot of support, particularly from students, for opening up the routes and having more flexibility, but recognising some of the concerns from some of the academic institutions in relation to particularly around transition and what that would mean.
Great. Thank you, Hugh. So Finn, if we move on to the next slide now. Thank you. So as part of the changes to the framework, we also proposed some new competency outcomes, which would be the threshold competencies required for registration as an architect. And the consultation showed high support across all of these. The quote there on the screen shows an example of some of the feedback we received on them. So the notion that the language of Miller's triangle, knows how, shows how, wasn't too familiar with people and could relate better to an academic context. And then we also heard that people expected to see more prominence given to certain topics in the competencies, like building technology, environmental sustainability, and safety, which we'd woven throughout, but perhaps weren't as obvious as they could be. And next slide, please, Finn. The last area on which we consulted was that we proposed a new quality assurance approach to how we accredit qualifications. And this included some new standards that will apply to universities and any other learning providers who deliver ARB accredited qualifications. So more respondents agreed than disagreed with every standard. But you'll see there's slightly lower levels of agreement than we saw on the competencies. And that's because roughly a third of respondents didn't have a view. So that grey bar there, between 29 and 36% of respondents didn't express a view either way on those standards. As with the draft competencies, we received some useful drafting suggestions about how we could improve the language and the clarity of them. And then we also found that students were more likely to agree than to disagree that the standards could create a better learning environment, and academics were the other way around. So academics were more likely to disagree that it would create a better learning environment. So I'm going to hand over to Simon now, who's our Director of Standards, to talk through what we're going to be doing with the outcomes, first of all. Simon.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca, and good afternoon, everyone. So, over the last 3 years, we've been using research and engagement to look at the competencies that all architects must have at the point of registration. We haven't drafted these up in a dark room. We've surveyed the profession. We've looked at international comparisons. We've engaged with the public. We've spoken to clients and to employers. And as Rebecca said, we published those draft outcomes in February and received lots and lots of feedback. So following that feedback, taking it all on board with our technical author, we've now finalised and published those outcomes. There are 44 outcomes. And you can see on the screen the example of, I think we've got professional and ethics there as an example. So what have we done since we first published the draft outcomes? Well, first of all, we've listened to what people have said in the evidence, and we've strengthened some of the outcomes, particularly in relation to building technology and those technical aspects that people say that need to be highlighted and strengthened a bit more, but also drawn out those key topics that we think sit across architectural practice. So you'll see there isn't, in the kind of like the competence domains, there isn't one that covers, for example, safety or sustainability, because that's we think that they're pervasive across architectural practice, and they sit across all of the competencies required. So we've done some work to draw those out, and we've also revised some of the language. We've listened to academics in particular who said that the language we were using in respect of Miller's triangle of knows how, shows how, and does didn't really sit very well with the pedagogy of architecture. So we've changed that. We've changed that as well to make that a bit more usable. So feedback means that we're pretty confident now that we've actually described the role of an architect to the future, that we think that these competencies of an architect being able to show what they can do, be able to demonstrate what they can do at point of registration as opposed to just what they've learned, will equip future architects with the skills and knowledge that they need. So now that they've been published, these outcomes are going to be implemented for all new architectural qualifications rolling forward. And Brian will talk a little bit more after me about transition. So each of those outcomes will be specifically assessed through the qualifications. Finn, do you want to move on to the next slide, which talks a little bit more about the accreditation for standards and learning providers? So as part of the consultation, we also proposed new standards for learning providers, and again we finalised those and published those as well on our website. And what these are requirements that learning providers must meet if their architectural qualifications are to be accredited by us. So taken together with the outcomes, they will ensure that somebody who's completed an accredited qualification will have the right competencies to join the register of architects. And as Rebecca said, there was a mixed response to those standards, but we've taken heart in the fact that certainly students agreed that that these proposals would strengthen the oversight of learning providers and create a better learning environment. Those standards focus on three key aims. First of all, that any student being awarded the architectural qualification will have met the competence outcome at the right level. Secondly, that each learning provider has sufficient resources in place to deliver the qualification. And thirdly, and importantly, and this is a rather new area for us, that we want to be assured that there's an organisational culture, a learning culture that will ensure consistent quality and to support students. So the aim is that these standards will offer flexibility to providers to be able to teach in a way that they think is appropriate and in a qualification that they think is appropriate, and use their skills and ability to do that, but yet giving us the assurance that anybody with an accredited qualification is going to meet the right competencies to be able to be registered. Brian, I think I'm handing over to you to talk a little bit more about transition and implementation.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Brian James. I'm the Director of Registration and Accreditation. So I am responsible for accrediting the qualifications that lead to UK registration. So now that the board has agreed this new framework, we're in a transition period. And the slide that you can see in front of you sets out some of those major milestones in terms of moving towards how we operate the accreditation framework. So Simon and Hugh have both mentioned that the quality assurance process that we're using is based on those competency outcomes for architects, but it's also based on standards for the learning providers. These standards and outcomes will apply to any new accreditation decisions from January 2024, so the January that's forthcoming. What this means is that any new qualifications that receive their first accreditation by us, they must deliver these outcomes. But obviously, we have currently a number of existing qualifications. The board has extended their prescription until December 2028 to allow providers to make plans for how they would demonstrate the new outcomes and the new standards. So those qualifications will continue to December 2028, but after that point, they won't be recognised for registration. So I think I just want to identify just a few things on these slides. And I suppose the first thing is that we're going to work with you very closely around how we support the information that we need for you to demonstrate that you're meeting the new outcomes. We haven't changed any of our monitoring or review dates for existing qualifications, but the standards that Simon has talked about, we'll be wanting to apply those at the point when we do the review. We are anticipating that because we need to have good insight into the governance that you have in your local organisations around the way that the qualification is delivered, we're anticipating, and this is based on feedback that you've given us, that it could take somewhere between 18 months and 2 years to go from making an application, engaging with us about a new qualification and it being accredited. So one of the key dates, which is indicated on the slide, is around January 2025, when we would start to see new qualifications. And then we would start to move into, from September 2027, qualifications being entirely under the new outcomes and standards. And then just finally to finish, before we get into the Q&A, and I can see some people have raised some questions about the transition, which I can address. We've also, we're establishing an education transition reference group. And the purpose of this is to get feedback from stakeholders around how the transition's going, how the guidance or handbook that we're producing for you to help you engage with us, how that's working. It's going to work on a topic based. It's not a decision making group, it's a reference group. And what we're proposing to do is have sessions like this one where we raise topics, people can give us feedback and we can consider that. It's going to be self-selection. It's not necessarily a quorate group. And if there are any sort of Q&As that come out of it, we'll make those available to other people. And if we get to the point where that transition group is no longer needed, then we'll cease to run it. But we're really keen to get feedback during this transition period. So Rebecca, maybe I'll stop there and then maybe you can help us with the questions.
Yep, great. Thank you, Brian. So thank you to those of you who've already submitted questions in advance or indeed during this session. Please do keep them coming. So we're going to start off with one that was submitted in advance by Adrian, who asked, how will ARB work with REBA and others to ensure that future architects have a greater technical knowledge of design and construction through to operation with impact on fire safety, low carbon, efficient, buildable designs? So that's a good question, and I will come to you, please, Simon, for that one.
Yeah, certainly. So in relation to fire and life safety and sustainability and building technology, we think that the outcomes are much more explicit than they were previously, and they're based on rather than inputs on outputs. We're confident that the outcomes are an improvement on what's there already. We will also be providing some additional guidance to learning providers in relation to fire and life safety and in relation to sustainability to help them deliver the course with that regard. And I know that the RIBA in particular produce some fantastic CPD material for architects once they're on the register in relation to kind of fire safety competence and all of those really important elements, recognizing the fact that the point of registration isn't the end of one's educational journey. It's just a stop off on the way, and no architect is going to be fully competent in any area at the point of registration.
Great, thank you, Simon. So a couple of other questions we've had in. There's one from John and a related one as well in here. So John asked, as buildings become more complex, formal education needs to be longer, not shorter. As architects regain the roles lost in recent years, education requires re-extending to include them in our education. How does shortening the academic courses help that? We've had a similar question saying, I want to see how the change from having a REBA Part 1 to enter into a REBA Part 2 will change the quality of learning without an undergraduate degree in architecture, and that was from Nagmana. So Hugh, similar questions there. Can we come to you on those, please?
Yeah, delighted. Thanks, Rebecca. So, John, you raised a question that is put to us quite a bit, and I guess without wanting to go back too far, I'll take us back to 1958. And the Oxford Conference, and this is when the current consensus, although I think it ceased to be a consensus for some time, but a consensus at the time was that there need to be 3 parts where we looked at a kind of an academic underpinning, and then, as you describe in your Q&A, adding complexity within design projects in a part 3. I think there's a few things that we've heard consistently. So one is that structure no longer works with consistent and high quality pedagogy, where it's about spiral learning, where you learn the knowledge around something and you apply it. And I think we haven't finished that journey, because clearly one of the bits we haven't managed to achieve through the consultation is how we integrate good, high quality professional practical experience. But that idea that's been in existence for the last 50 years that we should break it into 3 parts, I think that's been pretty consistent. And I think we've had some really helpful discussions with REBA as well, who've been looking to think about how there might be actually accelerated courses in relation to 5 years. I think the other really crucial bit is to not see this as a simple when do you finish university education and then go on to the register. I think one of the things we know with the added complexity, and you've rightly raised this, is that it's a lifelong learning journey. So I think there are some legitimate questions about what is the knowledge, skills, experience, and behaviours you need to come onto the register, but it doesn't stop there. So that's why, rightly, we've been pressurised and pushed to think about things like climate change, sustainability, fire and life safety design. And those aren't just things we've had to strengthen the undergraduate or the pre-registration education training, but in terms of CPD and lifelong learning. So it's a really important debate, and I think it will continue. But I think it's fair to say that that our view and the board's view is that that old structure, while it will work still for many, and I'm sure that REBA will continue with their traditional Part 1, 2, 3 model, as a regulator, our interest is the competencies coming on the register. We've certainly heard a lot from institutions about how they wanted to innovate, how they wanted to bring things like multidisciplinary education and training in, how they could work with designers better, with engineers better, and the current model didn't enable that. So I think what we would expect is that undergraduate, master's level and diploma will probably continue for the vast majority of people, but there will be universities who have been keen to innovate and to have better blended learning. There will be new innovations around practical experience out in the workplace. There will be people who want to think about how they can recognise high quality practical experience that may have been achieved either as a technologist or as a designer, but without having to force them back to that 7 to 9 years route. So I very much feel as though our aspiration is not to water down or reduce, but it's to strengthen. It's trying to provide more flexibility and allow innovation, recognizing that still in the future, for the majority, they will likely continue through a traditional undergraduate degree, followed by a master's qualification and a diploma, although we're very open, particularly around professional practical experiences, looking at new innovations. I don't want to pick on any universities in particular, but we've seen some high quality innovation from universities like Sheffield, who are trying to integrate practical experience within the courses, from other universities, and also the apprenticeships, which are not achieving necessarily what they want to do in terms of access, but some really positive feedback in relation to the quality of education training. So we want to allow those new models to develop while not undermining quality. Hopefully that covers quite a lot of the ground that John, you asked, and others have highlighted, but no doubt colleagues will jump in if there are things I've missed.
Great, thank you, Hugh. So we're getting quite a lot of questions of the what does this mean for me nature, so really specific ones about the different stages that people are at. Peter, I've seen yours and I've seen others come in as well. So we do have an FAQ on our website, which we'll just post into the chat now. So if you want to know what it means if you've completed a certain number of qualifications and where you're at in your journey, or indeed questions about the transition, if you're working at a university and you're thinking about what you need to do when, please do take a look at those FAQs, because there's a lot of specific questions there and we won't get through all of them. But I can see a few questions here on the transition from Mike. So Brian, I wonder if you can help with those. Just to read a couple of them out. So Mike's asking if we could clarify the earliest and latest date that a school can notify ARB if they wish to have a new qualification accredited, and then asking about existing qualifications, at what point they get classed as the new one and have to move over to the new outcomes, for example. So I'll hand over to you, Brian, to talk us through some of those answers, please.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks, Mike, for the questions. So in terms of the earliest date that you can apply for a new qualification, we would look to receive applications from January 2024. I guess if you are thinking of creating a new qualification, you can get in touch with us and you can, sort of give an indication of what you're intending to do. But the process would start from January 2024. And that's because we have a whole host of guidance, a handbook. We've got some standard templates in terms of the types of information that we would expect to see around the qualification and the approach that you would be taking. And the intention of that is to make that as standard and as easy and as user-friendly as possible. So the answer to your first question is from January 2024 onwards, but if you have things in mind, get in touch with us from now, effectively. In terms of your question about remapping, so if I can just reiterate what I said in the presentation, so all existing qualifications will be recognised, prescribed until December 2028. And if you wanted to, for want of a better word, convert those qualifications to the new outcomes, you'd need to do that so that the accreditation happened before the expiry of that prescription. So in other words, before the end of December 2028. However, you'd need to think of the lead time in terms of planning to engage with us. And as I mentioned, we are anticipating it's a sort of possibly 18 months to 24 months period before that. And what we obviously recognise and have had feedback from providers is we need to sort of match that against when terms or semesters would start and sort of business planning within providers. So you'd need to factor that time in before the expiry of the existing qualification. And I think just the third element of your question is we would need, whether a qualification was brand new or whether it was a conversion from an existing qualification, you would need to map all of the outcomes and the standards that Simon mentioned. And we would engage with you through that process. We'd ask for information, and then we would visit you either like we're doing today online or actually visit in person to understand your assumptions and how you would deliver the qualification when it was accredited. So the answer is that you would need to satisfy all of the outcomes and the standards through that accreditation process, whether it was taking something that already exists or whether it was brand new. And I hope that helps. Back to you, Rebecca.
Great, thank you, Brian. So Simon, I'm coming to you next for a question that Will has submitted about the criteria and how they map onto the new outcomes. So Will says that he has concerns about criteria 3 and 4 not being adequately represented in the new criteria, by which we mean the new competency outcomes. Can you clarify how they are represented in the new outcomes, if at all? Simon.
On the spot. 3 is fine arts, isn't it? And 4 is planning. So fine arts, the history of fine arts, I think GC3 was, which is covered now in the very opening outcome of contextual knowledge about the history of architecture. And planning's a really interesting one because planning's not explicitly referred to in the outcomes in the same way that building regulations aren't, in the same way that CDM isn't, in the same way that the Building Safety Act isn't, because the actual purpose of the outcome isn't that somebody knows planning or knows CDM or do that. The purpose of the outcome is to be able to demonstrate that you can produce competent designs within those constraints. So I think there are 12 design outcomes, and they focus on, are you capable of producing a design taking into account planning, taking into account building regulations, taking into account budgetary constraints, taking into account the requirement to produce sustainable solutions. So I think as long as my recollection of what the criteria was right, I think that's probably the approach we've taken. The only thing I would say is there will always be arguments. You will never have an agreement about the outcomes ultimately that everybody agrees on. I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that we put a lot of research and engagement into this over a long period of time. We've had good support as part of the consultation, and also recognizing that the bucket can only be so big unless we're going to train architects over 10-15 years. At some point we have to say that's enough for you to be safe, to be able to be access the register to become an architect, bearing in mind that that doesn't then represent the totality of knowledge and skill that you will need throughout your career. It's just a stopping point along the way. If I've got the criteria wrong, then I've made myself look a bit like an idiot then.
You should know them off by heart, Simon. Or read your messages so you know which questions I'm coming to you on. Fine. So I'm just joking. So we've got an anonymous question here, which has come in about the professional practical experience. So Hugh, I'm going to be coming to you on this one. So it says the 60% supporting retaining the 2 years practical experience encourages me to point to this suggestion, which has been nagging me for a while. Will ARB consider removing the requirement to chartered practices to pay students or architecture graduates for work experience, or something similar be removed, as it is hindering those interested in progressing to registration as architects in the UK? So that's quite a specific question, and it does make me wonder if this is about some REBA requirements here regarding chartered practices. But Hugh, I wonder if this is an opportunity to talk through what we are intending to do on PPE and how we're going to be revising our proposals on it.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. There's a few things wrapped up in that question. I think probably the first thing is to start out with what we proposed and what we're doing next. So the first is that we, as you said earlier, we were proposing that we would move from an input-based measurement saying you must have 2 years to a measurement that says actually it's less the time and more what you achieve within that 2 years. And I think there was a concern from respondents that actually that was a safety net that was really important. And actually we need to look more generally at what people need to be able to do in terms of work experience. And I think we found that quite compelling. I think we're looking at these in 2 stages. So the first is we're looking to see, can we update our guidance in relation to what can be included as part of the 2-year current requirements? So those of you who are familiar with the requirements will realize that work experience done as part of an undergraduate degree currently does not count. However, we do know that some institutions are providing some really innovative and excellent experience, and I think we need to think about what could be included. So we're looking at that as a sort of, is there something we can do in the short term? The second thing that people may be aware is we've announced that we're establishing a commission that would run probably for a year from about December, and that will start to pick up some of the points within the question that's been raised, which is some of the big problems that we've had highlighted as part of the consultation we've known for quite a while. So firstly is what needs to be covered. So for example, there is no current requirement that work experience must mean that you have some experience to a building site. Is that right? There is no requirement in relation to what might be called a kind of more familiar rotation-based system. So there are things you must cover throughout that journey, although there is some guidance, and we want to look at that. But probably the biggest challenge is really around funding and quality assurance. So at the moment, the feedback we get from practical professional experience is that some employers provide some really high quality experience, but it's variable. And I think others, including the University of Westminster, have published some really interesting research about that variation in quality. And we want to look and think, what can we do as a sector to improve that? The big challenge obviously is around funding. So at the moment, practical experience within architecture is not centrally funded. It's a transactional relationship between employee and employer. So the bit about payment, it's really about employment law. You know, the law says that you must pay people to do work, and that will continue. There is a question there about chartered practices, but obviously that's an issue for RIBA in relation to what they require as part of their chartered practice status. So over the next year, we want to look at this issue in depth, both in relation to what is included in practical experience, how might it be delivered, how might it be funded, and how might it be quality assured, because we do know that this is the area where there is consistent feedback that it's really inconsistent, and that some people have high quality experiences, but others have pretty poor experience, and that must be a fundamental part of the competencies required for registration as an architect. So watch this space, there will be some more on it.
Can I just add as well, and direct to the question, it's a legal requirement to pay as opposed to an RIBA requirement. If you're having someone carrying out work for your practice, then legally you have to pay for them unless they're formally recognised as an intern.
So that won't be something that's removed at any point. Thank you.
No, but obviously we will want to look at the how different professions fund practical experience. So so there are lots of options that we'll want to explore, but if people are working and doing jobs, they need to be paid for it.
Thank you, Hugh. We've got quite a few questions coming in about the practical experience element, and I think you've possibly already answered this one, but I'm just going to read out one from Fraser and ask if there's anything you'd add, Hugh, based on what you've just said. So one of the big barriers to those coming into the profession is obtaining opportunities for practical experience, as positions can be limited and difficult to get. Has ARB considered as part of these changes how to make opportunities for practical experience more readily available? So Hugh, is there anything you'd add to your previous answer about what we're going to be looking at?
Only that is something that we will be looking at. I mean, again, it's important to emphasize, I think this is one of the kind of more unusual elements within architecture, that in, for example, healthcare professions, training is generally centrally funded and is quality assured. In the legal professions and within accountancy professions, it's funded by employers, but very much with a direct link to an employment contract. Afterwards, architecture is unusual. Having that funding element, I think, is something we really do need to think about. No solutions yet, but that's why we're establishing the commission, because those are some of the things that we really do need to look at and understand what might be some alternative models that could exist, which not only provide the opportunities, but also are properly quality assured. I think geography is another issue that we've heard, that that the opportunities for practical work experience are very heavily dominated, not solely, but very heavily dominated by London and the Southeast. We're a UK regulator, and it's really important that we recognise that the sustainability of the profession is requires us to think about that wider UK-wide picture and how we can facilitate work experience across the UK. So those are all elements I think we'd want to, well, which I know are in scope of the commission, and there'll be more on that once we've identified a chair and got it up and running.
Yep, great. Thank you, Hugh. Simon, coming to you on this one next from Alan, which builds on the topic of professional practical experience. So Alan says there was mention by one of the presenters of a diploma associated with the practical experience element. Can that be elaborated on, please? So Simon, can you just clarify about that practice-related qualification, please?
Yes, certainly. So in the same way, currently there's a Part 3, and we don't use the term Part 3 because it's not ours, it's the RIBA's, and there won't be a Part 3 part from our perspective, 3 parts anymore. But if we take the Part 3, which is currently a professional practical diploma, that's something that we accredit, and we would continue to do that to accredit practical experience that a student has acquired. So no fundamental change in that regard.
Great, thank you. There's a question here from an anonymous attendee, which I'll take briefly before moving on to another one. So they say, Hugh previously referred to responses from academic institutions. Is it possible for ARB to identify institutional responses? So that's those coming from a university, an interested body, as a separate category of respondees. Well, what we do in our consultation is we ask people whether or not they are responding in an official capacity on behalf of their organisation, and then we invite them to name that organisation so that we can separate that group out and look at it. The majority of those tend to be small-scale architectural practices rather than institutions, but those that are institutions and agree to be named are all listed in the consultation report. So where somebody agrees to be identified, we can do that and we can look at them, but they're not a separate consultee group that they're asked to identify themselves as part of that. So there was another question coming from Ian, which I'll come to you, Brian. So do we have a date for when the handbook and templates will be published? Is this happening in advance of January 2024?
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Ian. Yes, is the short answer to that. So, Ian, we will be working to send around and publish the handbook materials and also the templates. What we're going to do is, and that will be in November this year, so it will give people time to reflect on them. We'll also seek some input or some feedback through the reference group that I mentioned. But also we'll be working closely with institutions that have their reviews coming up to go through exactly what we're expecting and how to use those templates. And I mean, if anybody has any questions around those templates in amongst all of that, they can always contact us directly in the accreditation team. But the short answer is yes, it will come out well in advance in the next month or so.
Great, thank you. So I've got a question here about the prescribed exam, and I'll come to you, Hugh, on this one. So Sonia is asking, now that the undergraduate degree in architecture will not be required as a regulatory function, will you change the eligibility for the prescribed examination at Part 1? Will you allow people who hold undergraduate degrees in architectural technology or interior design to take the exam? We had a similar question about the relevance of the prescribed exams from Will as well. Hugh.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks to the two questions. So I probably won't answer the question exactly as it's framed, but I think to take us back to the point, as an organisation, we're interested in competence. And at the moment, the competence for non-UK graduates, or those who've done a UK qualification that's not accredited, is to go through the prescribed examination at Part 1, Part 2, and then do a Part 3 qualification. It clearly must be true that if we're no longer going to require an accredited undergraduate degree, and for those to demonstrate competence at level 7 qualification, that we'll need to look again, and we are establishing a project to review the prescribed examination. That's something we've wanted to do for quite some time. So the simple answer is the current model of the prescribed examination will go, and it will go within the next 2 years. What we haven't confirmed is whether, and we've got a project to look at it, whether we need to do it in 2 stages where we change eligibility criteria, or whether actually we should do it in one point where we redesign or look at an alternative way. So it wouldn't be a 2 examination model. There might be an assessment of competence at that level 7 area, followed by the requirements of a professional practical diploma equivalent to, as Simon said, the Part 3. So the prescribed examination, its current form, will be changed, is being changed. But whether that's in 2 stages where we review the access criteria, or whether we do it within the next 2 years and have a new assessment which is based on the new learning outcomes, we haven't yet decided. The board will need to decide when we look at all the different risk factors. It's clearly quite complex, but for some time we've had a view that the current model needs to be updated and changed, not least because our interest is not what qualifications, for example, international people have done. It should be shifting more to, are they competent? So hopefully that's some reassurance. It's going to be refocused and reframed around a competency assessment and not input measures around a part 1 prescribed examination, a part 2 prescribed examination, and a part 3 prescribed examination. But watch this space, more information very soon.
Great, thank you, Hugh. Yeah, big project for us there. So I've got a question from Sally, and I'm coming to you, Simon, on this one. So Sally is asking, can you confirm what consultation with funding authorities has taken place, and what is meant by a non-ARB accredited undergraduate degree at level 6 or level 9 in Scotland, which is something we refer to in our FAQs. So I think this is an opportunity to talk through the position that we've reached on student finances and who you've spoken to for us to get there.
Yes, we've spoken to all of the funding bodies across the devolved nations, with the exception of Northern Ireland, but we've spoken to the Northern Ireland office in government instead. Student funding is fiendishly complex, so I'll try and keep it simply. But the message we've had is our proposals will not adversely affect any students who would be currently having the benefit of, for example, additional undergraduate funding at master's level. So our proposals will do no harm, I think is headline number 1. Headline number 2, we also accept that if we want to open up access to students who aren't going through the traditional undergraduate, master's, professional diploma routes, that beneficial funding wouldn't necessarily be available. So that's a challenge in our aim to increase diversity and access to the profession. But it's also true to say, certainly in England, all of the existing funding strategies are being thrown up into the air somewhat with lifelong learning. So we're speaking to government in particular and the Department of Education as to what opportunities there are for architectural education under any new reforms of lifelong learning. So that's a kind of a very high level explanation of that. We have been speaking, we have received assurance, we're continuing to speak, but it's complex.
Great, thank you, Simon.
Sorry, just Simon, on the question on the non-accredited degrees.
Yeah, so what do we mean by non what was the question? Non-accredited qualification?
Maybe I'll take that one because because it was a 2-part question. So I think the question was what do we mean by non-ARB accredited undergraduate degree at level 6 or 9 in Scotland? So essentially, the policy proposal it says that as a professional regulatory standards body, our interest is accrediting the level 7, the master's program. Many people will continue to do an undergraduate degree, which is regulated. It's regulated by higher education institutions. But ARB specifically is not planning to go in and have a specific program to accredit and put our stamp. What we're trying to do is to enable people who come through different routes. Now, that will provide some responsibility on some of the higher education providers, the universities, that if they wish to take people into their master's program who don't have an architecture degree, they might need to look at, and I think we're providing some guidance on that too, how they assess students and their ability to achieve those outcomes. So for those who've done a related degree, they might look at acquired prior learning. For what might be described as non-cognate or unrelated degrees, have a higher level of assurance required. But I think that's essentially what we're pointing to, that you might have done an architecture degree, but ARB won't be accrediting that at the level 6 undergraduate or 9 in Scotland.
Great, thank you, Hugh. So I've got a question here from James, which is about the work experience that architects undertake. So he says, as the qualifications are to be assessed on outcomes, would there be more opportunity for candidates to work in other professional offices which overlap with the role of an architect? As work in architects' practices seems to be the main barrier, could obtaining work placements in other offices, such as a surveyor or a project manager, be more heavily encouraged? So Simon, I'll come to you on that one.
Yeah, thanks. Good question, James. And it's useful to note, yes, on an outcomes-based model, then we should be relatively disinterested about where that experience has been sought, as long as the competence can be reached. From a personal perspective, I'm a little skeptical that anybody could reach the required competencies when not practicing in architecture. I'm not quite sure how they would do that, but I think we'd have to explore that further as part of the review on practical experience. But you're right, it's a barrier at the moment, but you need to balance that with would somebody actually be able to reach the competencies? I guess it depends on their involvement in architecture and what that other practice was carrying out. But clearly project management in itself wouldn't provide the opportunity to get the necessary experience.
Great, thank you, Simon. I can see we've still got 23 questions to get through and 4 minutes, so clearly we're not going to be able to do that. What we will do is look through the questions you've asked, and if there's any that we haven't been able to address in this session, then we'll update our FAQs and send them around to you to make sure that everything's covered. But on this last one, I'm going to come to you, Brian, because it's about when Part 3 will stop being accredited. So an anonymous attendee has asked, please can you clarify whether Part 3 will stop being accredited by ARB after December 2028, similar to Part 1? So that's the question about our transition.
Yeah, so I guess this is slightly caveated, this answer, in that the timescale for the transition that we are talking about is predicated on all qualifications being their expiry of their prescription being in December 2028. But I guess you've heard about what we're planning to do in the meantime. So we may have to review that. We may have to change that timeline, but certainly all existing qualifications at each of the parts are currently anticipated to cease their prescription by December 2028, either because the provider says they no longer want them to be prescribed, or they are replaced with a new or a remapped qualification. But as you heard from what Hugh was saying about the commission that we're proposing to do, we would obviously take any output of that into consideration in that timeline. But certainly that's the plan at the moment.
Thank you, Brian. And with 3 minutes to go, I'm going to just get through one last question. So Simon, I'm coming to you on this one, and we'll want a quick answer about that guidance that we've committed to writing. So this anonymous attendee has asked, will interior architecture students and architectural engineering students be able to become accredited if their programs are 75% similar to architecture students at undergraduate level? So it's a specific question, but Simon, could you talk a bit about what we're doing to address that access point?
The very short answer is ultimately it will be for the learning provider, the institution at that level, to decide whether they accept that student or not, taking into account their academic and or possibly work experience. What they need to be assured of is that the student has a fair chance of being able to meet the outcomes at the end of the level 7 qualification. So we will provide some guidance, but ultimately the decision on access to the qualification will be the individual learning providers.
Great, thank you. Well, apologies that we have run out of time and haven't been able to get through everyone's questions. We've been able to answer 18, 22 still open, but hopefully some of those have been addressed by the comments that we have made. This is being recorded, so we will be putting it on YouTube, and you can share it with anyone who's missed it and wants the answers. And we will also be updating our FAQs. If there is a question that you've asked that's not covered on our FAQs page, there is a way of contacting us. So please send your questions through to info@arb.org.uk, and we will direct it to the appropriate team. So if you've got a specific question about your situation that's not covered by our FAQs, please send it through there. With that, thank you so much for attending. Thank you to all of my colleagues for joining me in presenting, and we hope this has been a useful session for all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.